The stagecoach kicked up a storm of dust as it ground to a halt. Inside, Catherine Reynolds clutched a worn leather suitcase, her knuckles white. She was 35 years old, a woman whose face told the story of a life lived for others, caring for her parents until their final breath. But today was supposed to be for her. Today was the first day of a new life in Promise Creek, Colorado. She'd traveled 1,000 miles for this. "Last stop, madam," the driver grunted, tipping his hat. Catherine smoothed the wrinkles from her dress, the best one she had left, and took a deep breath. For 6 long months, she'd exchanged letters with a man named Albert Winters, a shopkeeper, a man looking for a wife to help with his store and fill the silence of his home. He seemed kind in his letters. Sensible. He knew her age, she'd made sure of that. She stepped out into the dusty street. Promise Creek wasn't much. A line of wooden buildings with false fronts stared back at her. A saloon, a general store, a little white church at the end of the road. It was a far cry from the life she'd known, but it was a chance for the family she'd always dreamed of. And then she saw him. A portly man in a tidy suit, standing right in front of the general store. He kept checking his pocket watch, his mustache twitching with a nervous energy. This had to be Albert. Gathering every ounce of courage she had, Catherine walked toward him, a hopeful smile on her face. "Mr. Winters, I'm Catherine Reynolds." The man's eyes went wide. He looked her up, then down. The anticipation on his face curdled, melting away into something else, something ugly. Disappointment. "Miss Reynolds," he started, then trailed off, clearing his throat. "But you're—" Her smile faltered. "I mentioned I was 35 in my letters, Mr. Winters." His face went red, a deep, blotchy flush that spread down his neck. "Well, yes, but I had assumed, that is to say—" He couldn't stand still, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Miss Reynolds, I was expecting someone more youthful, a woman who might still bear children." The words were a slap in the face, a physical blow that stole the air from her lungs. She'd known it was a risk. She knew men wanted young brides. But his letters, they'd felt different. He'd talked of companionship, of partnership. It was all a lie. "I see," she said, her voice a whisper. She fought to keep her chin up as the faces of strangers on the street began to turn their way, their eyes filled with a hungry curiosity. "I'm terribly sorry for the misunderstanding," Albert mumbled, refusing to meet her gaze. "But I don't believe this arrangement will work." He reached into his coat. "I've already paid for your passage, of course. Consider it a gift. Perhaps you could find work here, or continue on to another town." He tipped his hat, a jerky, awkward motion, and then he was gone, retreating into the darkness of his store. He left her standing on the boardwalk, a statue of humiliation with her trunk and suitcase at her feet. The stares of the townspeople felt like hot pokers against her back. The stagecoach was already pulling away, a cloud of dust in its wake. There was no going back. She had nowhere to go. She was alone, broke, and 1,000 miles from anything she'd ever called home. She wouldn't cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. Just as the first tear threatened to escape, a deep voice cut through the silence. "Madam, you look like you could use some help with that trunk." She turned, startled. A tall man stood there, his eyes the color of a summer sky. His face was weathered, tanned by the sun, with laugh lines that fanned out from the corners of his eyes. But he wasn't laughing now. He was looking past her, his gaze fixed on the general store where Albert Winters had disappeared. There was a quiet strength in his face, a genuine concern that made her want to trust him. But there was something else there, too. Something hard, something cold. "Yes, thank you," she managed. He lifted her heavy trunk as if it were filled with feathers. "Name's Daniel Morgan," he said. His eyes flicked back to the store, and his jaw tightened just for a second. "Where are you headed?" The shame washed over her again. I'm afraid I don't know," she confessed. "There's been a change of plans." Understanding dawned in Daniel's eyes, but it was a dark kind of understanding. "Albert Winters?" he asked, his voice low and tight. Catherine could only nod, mortified. Daniel's expression hardened. It wasn't pity she saw. It was something else entirely. It was a flicker of pure, unadulterated anger. "That man," he muttered, almost to himself. Then, turning back to her, his voice softened, but the cold glint in his eyes remained. "Promise Creek's a decent town, Miss Reynolds, despite some of the folk in it. There's a respectable boarding house run by a Mrs. Abernathy. I'd be happy to take you there." Relief was a tidal wave. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Morgan." "Daniel, please," he said, the hint of a smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Let's get you settled." As they walked toward his wagon, Catherine felt like every window in town held a pair of watching eyes. By nightfall, the whole town would be buzzing with the story of the mail-order bride Albert Winters deemed too old. Daniel seemed to read her thoughts. "Don't you mind them," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Small towns have long memories, but they also love a new story." He helped her onto the wagon seat, his touch gentle but firm. As they rode, a new thought began to trouble her. Daniel Morgan's kindness felt real, but the anger she'd seen directed at Albert's store, that felt real too. This wasn't just a simple act of charity. She was somehow caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. The boarding house was a clean, white building with a wide front porch. A plump, gray-haired woman with eyes that missed nothing appeared as they pulled up. "Daniel Morgan, twice in 1 week. The town will start to talk," she called out, a teasing note in her voice. "Mrs. Abernathy," Daniel said, his tone all business. "This here is Miss Catherine Reynolds. She's in need of a room." The older woman's gaze swept over Catherine, taking in the travel-worn dress, the suitcase, and the humiliation that surely clung to her like trail dust. A flicker of understanding crossed her face, but she didn't say a word about it. Instead, she just nodded. "Indeed I do. Come in, dear. You look plumb tuckered out." As Daniel set her trunk in the entryway, he tipped his hat. "Miss Reynolds, if you need anything, most folks can point you toward my ranch." He paused, his blue eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Promise Creek, it has a way of testing people, but the good ones always find their feet." His words sounded like a promise, but also a warning. After he left, Mrs. Abernathy showed her to a small, clean room. $2 a week, meals included," she said. Catherine's heart sank. Her money wouldn't last a month. "Mrs. Abernathy," she asked, desperation creeping into her voice, "do you know of any work in town? I was a school teacher back in Ohio." The older woman studied her thoughtfully. "Our school marm, Miss Perkins, just up and left. Getting married," she said. "Moved to Denver. The town council's been in a tizzy trying to find a replacement." Hope, fragile and bright, flickered in Catherine's chest. "I taught for 15 years. "Well then," Mrs. Abernathy said with a decisive nod. "You speak with Mayor Jenkins tomorrow. But be warned, dearie. The last teacher left in a hurry. Said this town had too many secrets for its own good." A chill went down Catherine's spine. What kind of secrets? And did they have anything to do with Albert Winters or the kind stranger with angry eyes? That night she lay in the strange bed, listening to the sounds of the town. She hadn't just been rejected. She'd been dropped into a puzzle, and every piece she touched seemed to hide another, darker piece beneath it. The next morning, Catherine put on her last good dress and went to see the mayor. Mayor Jenkins was a fidgety man who confirmed the teaching position was open, but not until the fall term. It paid well, $30 a month, and came with a small house. But fall was months away. He suggested she try the dress shop. Mrs. Peterson is always looking for help, he said, eager to move on to his next appointment. Mrs. Peterson, a brisk woman with nimble fingers, hired her on the spot. 75 cents a day for 10 hours of sewing. It was barely enough to survive, but it was a start. It was a foothold. As Catherine left the shop, feeling the first real glimmer of hope. Since she'd arrived, she almost collided with Albert Winters. He stopped short, his face turning that familiar shade of red. "Miss Reynolds," he said stiffly, "I see you've decided to stay." She lifted her chin, a spark of defiance lighting inside her. "Yes, Mr. Winters. In fact, I've been offered the position of schoolteacher, starting this fall." Surprise, and something else she couldn't quite name, flickered across his face. It looked almost like fear. "The schoolteacher," he stammered. "But Miss Perkins has moved on, I'm told," Catherine said, her eyes narrowing. Why would her new job make him so nervous? "Yes, well, good day," he said, and hurried away as if the devil himself were on his heels. As he rushed off, she saw Daniel Morgan down the street. He was leading a horse to the blacksmith, but he was watching them. He saw her, and a slow smile spread across his face. He raised a hand in greeting. On impulse, Catherine walked toward him, her mind racing. "Miss Reynolds," he said, his voice warm. "Or should I say, schoolmarm?" News traveled fast. "How did you know?" "Mrs. Abernathy mentioned you were heading to the mayor's office. Fine news. This town needs a good teacher. The last one, well, she wasn't cut out for it." "What happened to her?" Catherine asked, probing. "Mr. Winters seemed surprised I was taking her place." Daniel's smile vanished. He busied himself checking his horse's hoof. "Miss Perkins was a fine woman, a bit timid. She got it in her head that folks in this town weren't what they seemed, got spooked and ran off to marry a man in Denver she'd only met through letters." He looked up, his blue eyes unreadable. "Sound familiar?" The implication was clear, and it was terrifying. Was he suggesting that Miss Perkins had been a mail-order bride too, and that something in Promise Creek had scared her so badly she'd fled? The pieces were starting to connect, forming a picture she didn't want to see. Albert Winters wasn't just a cruel man who had rejected her. He was tied to the mysterious departure of her predecessor. And Daniel Morgan, the kind stranger, seemed to know all about it. "Perhaps I'll see you around town, Miss Reynolds," Daniel said, turning his attention back to his horse. "I like that," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. She had a job, she had a room, and now she had a mystery to solve. She wasn't just fighting for her survival anymore. She was fighting for the truth. The weeks crawled by. Catherine worked her fingers raw at the dress shop, saving every penny. In the evenings, she'd sit on the boarding house porch, listening to the town gossip, trying to piece together the story of Miss Perkins. No one said much. They'd just shake their heads and say she was a nervous sort. But Catherine saw the way they glanced at Albert Winters' store when they said it. Daniel stopped by the dress shop every few days, sometimes to buy something, sometimes just to talk. He never mentioned Albert or Miss Perkins again. He asked about her day. He told her stories about his ranch. He was patient and kind, and his presence was a comfort. But Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something back, that he was watching her, waiting for her to figure something out on her own. One afternoon, he appeared at the shop just as she was closing. "I came to see you," he said simply. "I was wondering if you might join me for supper tomorrow evening." She was so surprised she couldn't speak for a moment. Then, a warmth spread through her chest. "I'd be delighted." The smile that lit his face was genuine, and it made her heart do a little flip. "I'll call for you at 6. That night, Mrs. Abernathy helped her pin up her hair. "Daniel Morgan's a good man," the older woman said, her voice soft. "Keeps to himself, mostly. Hasn't been the same since he lost his family." "His family?" Catherine asked. Mrs. Abernathy nodded. "Lost his wife and son to a fever 12 years back, right after he first came here from Texas. Some say that's what broke him. He bought that land outside of town and just disappeared into his work. Hasn't so much as looked at another woman since." The story filled Catherine with a deep sadness for him. It also explained the shadows she sometimes saw in his eyes. The next evening, when Daniel arrived, he was dressed in a clean shirt and dark vest. He looked handsome and nervous, and for the first time, Catherine let herself feel a spark of hope for a future she hadn't dared to imagine. At the hotel restaurant, over soup, he looked at her, his blue eyes steady. "A woman's worth isn't measured in years, Catherine," he said, his voice low and sincere. "It's measured in character, and from what I've seen, you have that in abundance. Albert's a fool for not seeing it." He was speaking of Albert, but it felt like he was talking about something more. He was drawing a line in the sand. On one side was Albert Winters, a man who judged by appearances. On the other was Daniel Morgan, a man who saw what was underneath. As they walked back to the boarding house under a canopy of stars, he offered her his arm. The silence between them was comfortable, charged with unspoken feelings. "I wonder if you might like to see my ranch," he said as they reached the porch. "Perhaps this Sunday, after church." "I'd like that very much," she said. He took her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Catherine." As she lay in bed that night, replaying every moment of their evening, a new and unsettling thought emerged. Mrs. Abernathy said Daniel's wife and child died of a fever 12 years ago, right after he arrived. But Daniel had told her he came to Promise Creek 8 years ago. The dates didn't line up. It was a small detail, a tiny inconsistency. But in a town built on secrets, even the smallest lie could be the key that unlocked everything. Who was Daniel Morgan, really? And what other secrets was he hiding behind those kind, sad eyes? Sunday arrived, bright and clear. Catherine sat beside Daniel in the church pew, acutely aware of the whispers and curious glances. After the service, she saw Albert Winters watching them from across the churchyard, his face a mask of confusion and anger. It gave her a small, satisfying thrill. The ride to Daniel's ranch was beautiful. His home was a sturdy log house he'd built himself, surrounded by pastures and a gurgling stream. It was peaceful. It was a place a person could build a life. Inside, she was surprised to find shelves filled with books: Shakespeare, Dickens, Thoreau. He was more than just a simple rancher. They spent the afternoon walking the property, and later, sitting on the porch drinking lemonade. "It's a good life," he said, his eyes on the horizon. "Lonely at times, but good." He turned to her, his expression vulnerable. "I never expected to want to share this place with anyone again. After my wife, Eliza, and our son died, I thought that part of my life was over. Here it was, her chance to ask. Mrs. Abernathy mentioned you were widowed. She said it happened 12 years ago." A shadow passed over Daniel's face. He looked away. "Yes, 12 years this spring. The fever took them both." He was sticking to the story. "But why?" "She also seemed to think you came here right after," Catherine pressed gently. "But I thought you said you'd been here for 8 years." Daniel went very still. The silence stretched, thick with tension. He stared out at the rolling hills, his jaw working. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, that he would shut her out. "There were 4 years in between," he finally said, his voice rough with an emotion he was trying to suppress. "4 years I don't talk about. After they died, I lost my way. I drifted, worked odd jobs, drank too much. I'm not proud of that time, Catherine." He turned to face her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I came to Promise Creek to start over, to leave that man behind. That's why I say I've been here 8 years, because that's when my life truly began again." It was a plausible explanation, a heartbreaking one, and it made her feel ashamed for doubting him. But as he spoke, her eyes drifted to a small, weathered wooden chest tucked away in the corner of the porch. Carved into the lid were the initials EM and a date from 9 years ago, not 12. Another inconsistency, another secret. Before she could ask, he seemed to read the direction of her gaze, and his body tensed. He stood up abruptly. "It's getting late," he said, his voice strained. "I should get you back to town." The ride back was quiet, but the comfortable silence was gone. It had been replaced by a new, unspoken tension. He was hiding something. Something more than just 4 years of grief-stricken wandering. And she had a terrible feeling it was connected to the chest on his porch, and the date that didn't match his story. Catherine couldn't get the date on the chest out of her mind. 9 years ago, not 12. It gnawed at her. She spent her days at the dress shop, her mind a million miles away, stitching together scraps of conversations, rumors, and half-remembered gossip. She learned that Albert Winters had only become the sole owner of the general store about 9 years ago. Before that, he'd had a partner. A man who had left town suddenly after a terrible argument. No one seemed to remember the partner's name. Daniel continued to court her, but there was a new caution in his manner. He was still kind, still attentive, but he kept a part of himself closed off. The more she fell for the man he presented to her, the more she feared the man he was hiding. The school board officially offered her the teaching position, and she accepted. As summer began to fade, she prepared to move into the small teacher's cottage behind the schoolhouse. Daniel helped her, building her bookshelves, fixing a loose step on her porch. His acts of service were his language of love, and it was a language she understood. But his silence was a language too, and it spoke of secrets. One evening, just a week before school was to start, there was a knock on her cottage door. It was Albert Winters. He stood on her porch, twisting his hat in his hands, a desperate look on his face. "Miss Reynolds," he said, "I've come to apologize, and to warn you." She led him inside, her heart pounding. "Warn me about what?" "About Daniel Morgan," he said, his voice low. "He's not who you think he is. He's a vengeful, dangerous man." Catherine stiffened. "I think you're the last person who should be giving me warnings about men, Mr. Winters." "Please," he begged, his composure cracking. "You have to listen to me. Do you know why I turned you away that day? It wasn't just your age. It was him, Daniel Morgan. He came to me the day before you arrived. He told me if I went through with the marriage, he would ruin me. He said he'd tell everyone in this town a secret that would destroy my life." Catherine stared at him, her mind reeling. "What secret?" Albert shook his head, his face pale with sweat. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that he's using you, Miss Reynolds. He's using you to get to me. Everything he's done, the kindness, the courtship, it's all a lie, a way to hurt me." He leaned forward, his eyes wide with fear. 9 years ago, I had a business partner. Morgan looks just like him, but older, weathered. I think it's him. My partner's name was David Martin. He had a wife named Eliza. They had a son. David Martin. DM, not Daniel Morgan. The pieces slammed into place with dizzying speed. The different timelines, the initials on the chest, the date. It wasn't a fever that had taken Daniel's family. It was Albert. "What did you do to them, Mr. Winters?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Albert flinched. It was a business disagreement, nothing more. He was a fool, he overextended, and I bought him out for a fair price. He left town with his family, that's all. You're lying, she said, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. You ruined him, and his family. They didn't leave, did they? They died. Here, that's Daniel's secret, isn't it? He's not Daniel Morgan. He's David Martin. And he's been living here, right under your nose, for 8 years, planning his revenge. And you were so self-absorbed you never even recognized the man you destroyed. The color drained from Albert's face. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Before he could respond, the cottage door creaked open. Daniel, or David, stood in the doorway. His face was a thundercloud, his summer sky eyes now stormy and dark. He wasn't looking at Albert. He was looking at her. And in his eyes she saw not the kind rancher, but the broken man he'd been for 12 long years. The man who had just heard his entire plan, his entire secret life, laid bare. Now you know, he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. The silence in the little cottage was suffocating. Albert Winters was frozen in his chair, pale as a sheet. Daniel stood in the doorway, his face etched with years of pain and a fresh wave of despair. He had been exposed, not by his enemy, but by the woman he was learning to love. "Tell me everything," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. She wasn't speaking to Albert. She was speaking to Daniel. He finally tore his gaze away from her and fixed it on Albert. The look was so full of cold hatred that Albert visibly shrank. "His name was David Martin," Daniel said, his voice flat and dead. "He came here with his wife, Eliza, and their 4-year-old son, Thomas. He had a dream of building a life. He partnered with this man." He spat the word. "They built the general store together. David put in every cent he had. Albert handled the books." He took a step into the room. The business was doing well, or so David thought. But Albert was cooking the books, siphoning money, creating false debts. When he had bled the business dry from the inside, he called in the fake debts and forced David to sell his half for pennies on the dollar. He took everything. "It was just business," Albert whimpered. "Business!" Daniel roared, the sound shaking the small room. "You left us with nothing. Winter was coming. I couldn't find work. We couldn't afford a doctor when Eliza and Thomas got sick. I sat there and watched my wife and my son die because I couldn't give them a warm bed or a simple dose of medicine. That wasn't business. That was murder." He took another step, and Albert scrambled backward, knocking over his chair. "I buried them," Daniel continued, his voice dropping to a raw, chilling whisper. "And then I left. I tried to forget. For 4 years I drifted, but I couldn't outrun their faces. I couldn't outrun what he did. So I came back. I changed my name. I bought land far enough out of town that no one would bother me. And I waited. I waited for the right moment to take from you everything you took from me." He looked at Catherine then, his eyes filled with a terrible sadness. "When I heard you were coming, I saw my chance. I knew what kind of man he was. I knew he'd be too shallow to see past your age. I planned to use his rejection of you to turn the town against him, to ruin his reputation. And then I met you." His voice broke. "I never planned for this, Catherine. I never planned to care for you. That wasn't part of the plan." Here was the final, devastating twist. His kindness hadn't been a lie, but it hadn't been the whole truth either. It was born from a plan for revenge. She was a pawn who had accidentally become the queen. "So what now?" she asked, her heart aching for the man in front of her, the man who had suffered so much. "What's the rest of your plan, Daniel? Or David?" Before he could answer, the door swung open again. Sheriff Miller stood there, his hand resting on his gun. "Heard some shouting," he said, his eyes moving from Daniel's furious face to Albert's terrified one. and finally to Catherine. "Everything all right in here, schoolmarm?" Albert saw his chance. "No, Sheriff, it is not. This man, this Daniel Morgan, he's an imposter. His real name is David Martin, and he's been threatening me. He's mad. Arrest him." The sheriff looked at Daniel, his expression unreadable. The whole town was about to be torn apart, and Catherine was standing right in the middle of the explosion. She had to make a choice. She could expose Daniel's lies and let the law handle it, or she could stand with the broken man she'd come to love and see his quest for justice through to the bitter end. What would you do in her place? Catherine looked from Albert's craven, fearful face to Daniel's, which was a mask of grief and fury. Then she looked at the sheriff, a man she knew to be decent and fair. She took a deep breath. "There's been a misunderstanding, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But no threats. Mr. Winters came here to discuss a business matter with Mr. Morgan. It seems they were partners, a long time ago." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "It is," she said, meeting Daniel's shocked gaze. "And I believe Mr. Winters owes Mr. Morgan a great deal of money. That's what they were shouting about. A debt, long overdue." Albert stared at her, dumbfounded. He opened his mouth to protest, but Catherine cut him off. "In fact," she said, an idea forming in her mind, "I believe the ledgers from 9 years ago might clear this all up. The ones from the general store. You wouldn't have any problem with the sheriff taking a look at those, would you, Mr. Winters? Just to settle this business disagreement once and for all." Panic flared in Albert's eyes. He knew what those ledgers would show. The sheriff, sensing a real story, turned to him. "Well, Albert, what about it?" I don't know where they are. It was years ago," he stammered. "Convenient," Daniel said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's go have a look anyway," the sheriff said, grabbing Albert by the arm. "You and I are going to your office, Albert. We're going to turn it upside down until we find those books." He tipped his hat to Catherine. "Ma'am, sorry for the disturbance." He dragged the protesting shopkeeper out the door, leaving Catherine and Daniel alone in the sudden quiet. Daniel just stood there, staring at her as if he'd never seen her before. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "You should have let him tell the sheriff. I'm a liar. I deceived you." "You did," she agreed, stepping closer to him. "But you're not a murderer. He is. He let your family die. There's no justice in you hanging for threats while he profits from their graves. The truth is in those ledgers. That's the only justice that matters." Tears welled in his eyes, raw, unchecked tears of a man who had held his grief in for over a decade. He took a staggering step forward and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. His body shook with silent, racking sobs. She held him tightly, her own tears staining his shirt. She was holding 12 years of pain, 12 years of solitude and hate. They were married a month later, on the first Saturday of the new school term. The whole town came. The sheriff had found the ledgers, tucked away in a dusty corner of Albert's back office. The evidence of his theft was undeniable. Faced with prison, Albert Winters sold the store for a fraction of its worth, paid the money he owed Daniel's estate, and left Promise Creek on the midnight stage, a disgraced and broken man. Justice had been served. Catherine and Daniel, he kept the name, saying David Martin had died with his family, moved to the ranch. She rode to town each day to teach the children, and he worked the land, the anger slowly draining out of him, replaced by a quiet peace she had never seen in him before. Their life was simple and good, and built not on a plan for revenge, but on the solid rock of a shared truth. One spring evening, years later, as they sat on the porch, Daniel took her hand. "I've been thinking," he said softly. "This ranch feels like a home now, with you here. But maybe there's room for more. He looked at her, his blue eyes full of a hesitant hope. There are children who need homes, Catherine. Orphans in Denver with no one. I know we're not young, but... Tears sprang to Catherine's eyes. The dream of motherhood she thought had died long ago was suddenly, miraculously, alive again. I've seen you with your students, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You were born to be a mother, and I'd like the chance to be a father again. She threw her arms around his neck, her heart so full it felt like it would burst. Yes, she whispered. Oh, yes. They built a family, not from blood, but from love. First they adopted Sarah and Michael, and then, a few years later, twin boys who'd lost their parents. The ranch, once a place of lonely exile, was now filled with the sound of children's laughter. On their 10th anniversary, Catherine stood on that same porch, watching Daniel ride in from the fields with their sons. At 45, her hair had streaks of silver, and the lines on her face spoke of a life fully lived. Daniel, older now and slower, still looked at her with the same love that had healed them both. Do you ever regret it? He asked, sitting beside her on the swing. Everything that happened, the lies, the danger. She shook her head, leaning against his sturdy shoulder. If Albert hadn't been a fool, and if you hadn't been a man bent on revenge, we never would have found each other. Our worst moments led us right here. She smiled. It turns out my greatest blessing was being told I was too old. He pulled her close. You are my greatest blessing, Catherine Morgan. You always will be. She had come west looking for a husband, but found so much more. She found a man who needed healing, a town that needed the truth, and a family that needed a mother. She had learned that love doesn't care about your age, or your name, or your past. It only cares about your heart. If you enjoyed this story of how a terrible rejection led to true justice and love, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of the unexpected.